Welcome to the Crumps Barn Studio podcast. My name is Lorna Brookes. I'm the main editor here at Crumps Barn Studio, and today I'm being joined by Michael Bartlett. Michael is the author of two collections of short stories. My Village in the Valley is a comedy collection, and Personal Islands has a more literary flavour. Michael is also a radio scriptwriter of some renown, writing for BBC Radio Drama for many years and also Radio 4 series The Archers. So welcome, Michael. Thank you for joining me today.
Good morning.
So I have to say, with this incredible CV, I'm very curious about how you got started.
I've been a professional writer now for over 40 years, mostly writing plays for radio, television and theatre, all of which have been very satisfying over the years. I've earned a good living from it, but of course they're all ephemeral. They're broadcast and they're gone. This is my first venture into print publication, and I'm absolutely delighted because now I've got two books with my name on that can sit on the shelf, something to leave to my children, and a physical representation of many years of work. Technically, my first successful piece of writing was in 1954 when I was 8 years old. I entered a competition, an essay competition run by our local newspaper, the Merton and Malden News in South London, and I won 2 tickets to Billy Smart Circus on Clapham Common. My father at the time was somewhat dubious about this as a potential career on the grounds that he then had to buy another 3 tickets and all the train fares in order that the whole family could go to the circus. He needn't have worried. It was 18 years before I had another successful piece of writing. In my teens, I wrote short stories, as many people do, submitted lots of them, total rejections. I wrote poetry. No, let's say verse. I wrote verse. I never did anything with that, and that's probably just as well. But in 1972, I had my first success and sold a radio play to Radio 4 called Happy Death Day to You, and my writing career was on the way. I've written a lot of radio plays. I've written some television plays, many of them for children. I've written a number of theatre plays, some original, some adaptations of classic novels. Some of those have been a bit of a challenge, really. There was a theatre company in Surrey, where I was living at the time, that produced small-scale theatre productions to tour around schools and libraries and places like that. And they commissioned me. They wanted to commission me to write a stage adaptation of a Jane Austen novel. Now, I'm not a huge Jane Austen fan, and their suggestion was that I should do Emma, which they reckon they could tour quite successfully. Well, I have read Emma, and the only thing I'd want to do with Emma is bury a phalanx in the back of her neck. So this didn't seem to be a terribly good starting point for a successful adaptation. In the end, what I suggested, I read Persuasion, which I actually think is a very good novel. And I suggested this, and they said yes, and we did it. What made it interesting was that their conditions were that their adaptation, because they're touring it around very small venues, their adaptation had to be for a cast of 4 only and with no sets. Now, you know, the BBC don't have restrictions like that when they do a costume drama, but that actually, for me, made it interesting. And in the end, I opted for doing it with all the cast playing several parts, apart from the actress playing Anne. And periodically they stepped out of character and addressed the audience as narrators to sort of help the story along. I mean, it's quite a long novel. You've got to whip it along a bit if you're going to get everything in. And either side of the stage was a hat stand, a Victorian type hat stand, and on that were various cloaks and costumes and sticks and things. And as the actors on stage changed character, they picked off a different bit of cloak or a different stick or something like that and changed with it. I have to say it was pretty successful on the whole, though I think 4 actors covering that lot in the space of a couple of hours or so. I'm surprised we didn't have more heart attacks. But anyway, they got through it. And what was really nice for me was in the interval, I was sitting up the back at the first night at the little theatre in Surrey. And in the interval, I heard a couple of ladies talking and saying, "Isn't it lovely? I'm really enjoying this. And how on earth do they afford so many actors?" And I thought, actually, there's only 4 of them, but no, we'll let that go. It's obviously working.
So really, I've been misdescribing you all this time, saying radio scriptwriter and author. It's author, radio scriptwriter, and playwright. Of course, The Archers is probably one of the more famous radio shows. So I've got to ask, how did you get involved in that?
The honest answer is that I've been working as a radio drama producer and script editor for radio drama for some years, and I left in the early 1980s. And I was we moved to Guildford out of London. I was writing full time and I was quite happy. And then I got a call out the blue one day from the network editor in Birmingham, BBC network editor in Birmingham, saying that the script editor on The Archers was about to resign and go and work for Crossroads. Probably not a good decision, but there you go. And he'd been talking to the head of radio drama in London, and my name had been suggested to take over from him, which was very flattering. I was flattered because the life of a freelance writer is, how can I say, financially precarious would probably be a good way of putting it. And I was tempted for a moment, but then I said, now, presumably, if I took this on, it would be a full-time job. Oh, yes. And I'd have to move to Birmingham. And he said, well, you'd have to move to somewhere in the Birmingham area. Yes. And we had literally only been living in Guildford for about 6 months. My wife was working in London and I didn't fancy that. So after some thought, and actually I was just starting, although the finances weren't brilliant, I was just starting to appreciate the freedom of being my own boss, doing what I wanted to do when I wanted to do it. So I said no. So he came back and said, yes, they told me you'd probably say that. But in that case, would you join the writing team for a while? Because the other person I've got in mind to take over as script editor of The Archers doesn't have a lot of drama experience. They have radio experience, but not drama experience. So would you be willing to join the script writing team? And then you could sort of offer a helping hand with the other side if and when it turned out to be necessary. Oh, yes, I said, I can do that. And that's how I came to write for The Archers, which basically meant once a month I had to go up to Birmingham for a script meeting and followed by a Chinese meal. And I could live with that. You know, that wasn't a problem.
How incredible to be, well, basically headhunted for the part. And so how do you approach writing for the different formats?
Well, the thing about the radio play, of course, is that the only way you've got to convey information to the audience is through dialogue. You can have a narrator if you really insist, and some dramatizations of classic novels do that. I personally hate the sort of third person narrator who says something like, it's 1816 and John and Mary are walking in the garden, da-di-da-di-da-di-da. I hate that. I don't mind a first person narrator says, well, I was sitting on the bus and I just dropped my ice lolly into the bag of the lady next to me when, and then something happens. That's fine. That's me being part of the action rather than something removed from it. In a radio play, you've got 4 tools, really. You've got the dialogue, you've got music, you've got sound effects, and you've got silence. And silence is often the very valuable tool that many beginners in radio don't always appreciate. An example is a piece of dialogue that goes like this. Do you still love me? Of course I still love you. Do you still love me? Of course I still love you. And you've changed the meaning completely because you don't believe the second one. That's quite interesting. There's also the biggest problem. I was for a while a script editor for afternoon theatre on Radio 4. And the biggest problem that I used to come across with people who sent in radio scripts was that the dialogue, it wasn't that it wasn't believable, that every person in the play actually spoke in exactly the same way with exactly the same voice. And of course, people don't do that. People use different words, they use different structures, they speak in different styles. And if you're going to be a successful radio writer, you need to understand that, appreciate it, and use it. I once said to a writing group I was talking to that to be a good radio writer, you need to listen to how people think. Listen to how people talk. So whether you're on a bus or in a shop or in a pub or somewhere, listen to other people's conversations. Eavesdrop. I mean, as unobtrusively as possible, maybe, but eavesdrop and just hear the different speech patterns that people use. Somebody then accused me of being immoral because I was suggesting that I should eavesdrop on other people's conversations. But it's your point of view. You've got to understand how people talk if you're going to write good radio.
And I suppose, does the same rule apply to short story writing? In your collection of short stories, My Village in the Valley, which is the comedy collection, they sound quite true to life.
The background to this is that in 2006, my wife and I moved from Guildford to a small rural village in Norfolk. Basically, we moved from a city of 67,000 people to a tiny village of 300 people. That was something of a culture shock. But in 2 months here, we had met more people than I'd met in Guildford in 22 years. We soon became very involved in the local community, events in the village hall, helping to run the village magazine, all that kind of thing. And it wasn't long before I realized that listening to people talk about things that happened to them or happened to people they know, listening to other tales about life in Norfolk, especially, but not exclusively, rural Norfolk, I realized that life in a rural area is far more outrageous than the Archers. And I decided that I could do something with this. And so the ideas for My Village in the Valley were born. There's nothing autobiographical in these stories at all. They contain elements of people I've met, inevitably, as any writer will do. They contain elements of things I've seen or heard about. But you take all these different elements and you weld them together into a separate whole. They are not autobiographical stories. And as I was able to reassure my neighbors, there was no need for them to put their solicitor on standby. I'll give you a couple of examples. There's a village about 7 or 8 miles north of Starston on the back road into Norwich. And until recently, there was a sign at the bottom of a drive there that said bed and breakfast and butchery. Now, I understood that entirely. You know, they're running a bed and breakfast business and they're doing their own butchery on the farm. But actually, if you put those two together, it's slightly unnerving. It's not quite psycho, but you do just wonder what goes on if you go up that drive. That's in the stories somewhere. Also, on the main road into Norwich from here is, I suppose you'd call it a conurbation. I'm barely a village, called Newton Flopman. There's nothing particular about Newton Flopman. I dare say it's a perfectly nice place to live, but I liked the name. And so one of the characters in one of the stories in My Village in the Valley is called Newton Flopman, known as Newt to his friends. Obviously, if you don't live in this immediate area of Norfolk, you won't get that, but it doesn't matter. It's a nice name and it does the job. Personal Islands is something that it's a collection of 10 totally individual short stories for a start. And they weren't all written as a collection. They were stories that were written over a period of time, but they came together as a collection round about 2011. Now, all of them are about some aspect of solitude or being alone or isolation. And in 2011, this was just a theme that interested me. I've always, in my own mind, I've always made a distinction between being alone and being lonely, which I think are two completely different things. Being alone can often be a personal choice. Being lonely probably isn't a personal choice. Well, back in 2011, these were interesting themes, but of course, in the light of the events of the last couple of years, they're even more pertinent. So now I think is a very good time for Personal Islands to be published. The stories are all very different. They are all set on an island of some kind or another. How can I put this? Some of them are real islands like the Isle of Wight or Shetland or the Falklands or well, that'll do. Some of them are abstract islands, such as the isle in a supermarket or the island, traffic island in the middle of the A3. But they're all about, as I said, solitude and isolation. The extract I'm going to read you now is from a story called Sand Between the Toes, and it's set on the Isle of Wight. Bit of background before I read this extract to put you in the picture. It's 1957. Peter is 11 years old and will be starting grammar school in September. Although his family is a happy one, he often feels isolated. His twin siblings are 5 years younger and naturally get most of the parents' attention. He may not fully realize it, but this is a stressful time for him. New school, homework, and so on. Then he's told that the family are going to Sandown on the Isle of Wight for their summer holiday instead of Westgate as usual, and he's very upset. However, he soon discovers there are compensations. Now he's 11, he's allowed to have dinner with his parents in the evening rather than children's tea. He finds he's been given new freedoms, more independence, and he begins to discover things about himself which are very exciting. One afternoon, they were making their way back to the Culver private hotel from the bus stop up near the railway station. They'd walked over the headland that afternoon and down into Bembridge, and then caught the bus back to Sandown. It had been a long walk, and the twins were tired. Dad was carrying Joan, and Mum was holding Richard's hand, coaxing the little boy along with the promise of tea. He was some way behind them when suddenly his attention was caught by a strange array of bricks over the doorway. The front door of the house opened straight onto the street, and the house itself was built of quite ordinary bricks. However, over the doorway itself, bricks of a different colour and shape had been used to create a kind of arch. The doorway didn't need an arch, so the bricks must have been laid like that for decoration. He paused to look more closely and saw how they'd been neatly fitted together, not just to make an arch, but so the different colours formed a pattern. I wonder who decided to do that, he thought. Was it the person who planned the house, the builder, the person the house was being built for, or just a sudden idea by the man who was laying the bricks? He stood back a bit to see it in perspective. It was a delightful sight and made the house look completely different from those on either side. He imagined that he was the bricklayer, standing back to admire his work in context, and then, as if from a great distance, he heard Richard's voice, the voice of his younger brother, who was tired and hungry. "Mum, Mum, look, Peter's lingering." He sighed and turned, expecting to be told to hurry up and come along, but to his surprise, he saw his mother give Richard's hand to Dad, and then she came walking back towards him. "I'm sorry," he began, but she shushed him with a quick smile. "What have you found?" she asked. He showed her the strange arrangement of bricks, and she seemed to understand. Like him, she stood back from the wall to get the full effect, and then she smiled. "It's lovely, isn't it? Different. Whoever did that had an eye for beauty. It makes the house stand out, Mum. It makes it different from all the rest." "Indeed it does. How did you spot it?" He thought about it. He wasn't sure. "I don't know. I just saw it. I like looking at things, really looking at them, having time to think about them, not just rushing off to whatever's next." He paused, feeling rather embarrassed, but his mother just nodded. "It's a busy old world, isn't it?" she said. "Does us good to linger sometimes." He struggled to express feelings that he hardly knew he had. "Sometimes I feel pushed. It's like being on my bike going downhill when the brakes aren't working properly." He looked up at her, half expecting her to laugh, but she just nodded thoughtfully. "I know. Things take you over, and sometimes it's difficult to stop them." For a moment, she seemed lost in thought, and then she looked down at him and smiled. "Never stop looking, Peter. You never know what you might find, but you won't see anything unless you look for it." He thought that was a rather obvious thing to say. Of course you had to look for something if you wanted to find it. But then he thought, but I didn't want to find the bricks. I didn't know they were there. And I didn't know I'd find that seaweed the other day. And he began to get a glimmer of what his mother meant. "Does everyone see things they're not looking for?" he asked, struggling to express the not fully formed thought in his mind. His mother laughed, but a nice laugh, as though she were laughing with him, not at him. "No, they don't," she said. "In fact, very few people see anything apart from the things they expect to see." His brow furrowed. Another new thought. It was proving to be a very strange afternoon, and all because he stopped to look at a few bricks. He looked up at her, wondering how he was supposed to react, not sure what to say in reply. She must have realized this, because she smiled again. "Don't worry about lingering, Peter. It's good to linger sometimes. It can give you time to sort out what you really think. And being curious is how we learn, so it's good to see with your own eyes. And you do a lot of that, don't you?" Was she talking about the seaweed, he wondered, or about living in Carisbrooke Castle? He must have showed his disquiet, because she quickly came to his rescue. Now look, Dad and I need to get the twins back for tea. They're very tired. But there's no need for you to rush. You stay here for a bit if you want. You know what time dinner is. Just get back in time to have a wash first, all right? All right. He watched her make her way back to the rest of the family and then turned to look at the bricks again. He wasn't quite sure how it had happened or what had happened exactly, but somehow he knew he'd been granted another freedom. His mother had given him something precious, and while he didn't understand exactly what it was, he sensed that he would come to value it in time. And I did. 52 years have passed since I first spotted those bricks, and now I'm standing looking at them again. I was slightly surprised to find them still here. So much else has changed. If my mother thought it was a busy old world in 1957, then I don't know what she would have made of 2010. We came back to Sandown for one more holiday after that first one, and then moved on to other places. By then, I was more used to change. The challenge of grammar school had been faced, and although I didn't particularly enjoy it, we reached an accommodation with each other. I learned Latin. I learned French. I learned I didn't like playing rugger. But perhaps the most important lesson I learned was that institutions of whatever kind do not always welcome individuals. I was lucky, I suppose. My parents always encouraged me to think for myself, make my own decisions. In the innocence of childhood, I thought all parents were like mine, until I grew up and discovered they weren't. My mother in particular did not so much teach me as allow me the freedom to learn for myself. With hindsight, I can see that they wanted to help me become me, not hurry me into a mirror image of themselves. I will always be grateful for that. To be honest, I'm not quite sure why I've come back to Sandown now after all these years. Inevitably, as time passed, the pace of life speeded up. Lingering was not always an option. And like many people, I found I was often running like mad to stay still. But somehow, in a funny sort of way, in the telescoped inaccuracy of memory, I feel that my life, my real life, began here. Perhaps that's it. Now, in this moment of sadness, I'm reaching back to find something stable on which I can begin to rebuild. That may be fanciful, but whatever the reason, here I am. Sandown today is very different from the place I remember, of course. The Culver private hotel has gone. So is the hot dog stall that stood near it on the front. The boating lake has become a crazy golf course. But the sea is still there, and so is the sand with its hard little wrinkles, where would-be Joe Roots now swing their bats with the same glee and enthusiasm as I, a would-be Peter May, once hit sixes into the sea. For me, the substance of Sandown has not changed. Which is why I've come back again, seeking solace which I know I may not find. In spite of all the changes that have taken place in the world and in me since that summer of 1957, the basic things still remain. The ability to take pleasure from the shape of a leaf, the cadence of a piece of music, a shadow glimpsed on a blind, the smell of the salt sea in the early morning, the feeling of old stone under my hand, and the realization that my mother was secretly just the same. That's why I'm here, staring at my bricks again, and I'm pleased to find they still speak to me, even after all these years. They were put there, not just out of necessity, but from a desire on someone's part to create something attractive. They touched my 11-year-old soul all those years ago, and they touch me still. In a while, I will walk down to the beach, maybe even take my shoes off and feel the sand ridges under my bare toes. But first, I will look at my bricks for a little longer. I will linger here a while and try to learn again the lesson of moving slowly.
Wow. It's fascinating to me, particularly as your publisher, to hear you read with your own voice something that I know very well because of course we work together very closely to edit it. One of the points we discussed early in the process of publishing this book was how the short story format is often quite overlooked in the industry. Publishers are often hesitant to publish volumes of short stories, so I am noticing that it is gradually improving. But for me, that reading you've just given, for example, it really stands out how full a picture you're able to give in really quite a few number of words. And I know you're working on a full-length novel at the moment, so you're actually quite well placed to discuss the differences. I mean, do you find there is a significant difference between how you approach a short story versus how you're approaching the full-length novel at the moment?
Well, the temptation, of course, is to think that a short story is easier than a novel because it's got less pages and you need less words to tell the story. I think that's wrong. I think actually the difficulty about any piece of creative writing gets harder and harder the shorter it gets. Probably the hardest form is a poem, a proper poem. In a short story, you've got very little time to paint a picture, draw your characters, develop an idea, and it probably is a single idea. It may be a double idea, but it's probably a single idea. In a novel, which is obviously much longer, you probably do need an element of plot. I have written now 3 novels, and they've all had a very clear starting point. They've all had very clear milestones as to places I want to pass through. None of them have actually had any idea of how it's going to end until I actually start writing. And I'm a great believer in that if you have an idea, and it needs to be character based, even if it's going to be a plot based novel. If you have an idea, then you've got to start writing. And I found it very difficult to get across to various writing students I've spoken to over the years, the idea that you might spend a day writing something of which perhaps only a paragraph will remain in the final whole. You should never be afraid just to write and see where it goes. If it goes wrong, well, it goes wrong. You go back, you find somewhere else, and you pick up from there. You should never be afraid to throw away, though in these days of computers, it might be an idea just to park it in a spare file somewhere, because you know, 3 weeks time, you discover actually it's not quite as bad as that. You need a bit of it back again. But you do need to move forward. I write almost every day. I mean, just recently with the launch of these books, it hasn't happened, but I write almost every day. I start at about 9:30 in the morning, and I go on to lunchtime, and then I finish for the day. I try and finish knowing where I'm going next, because that makes starting the next morning easier. Sometimes that's not possible. Sometimes, because there's other things in life that intrude, you might find that you can't come back to it for 2 or 3 days, and then you've got to reread your way into it, and that can take time as well. But you should never be afraid to go right in, get it down on paper or on the screen, and see where it's going to take you. And I think that's a discipline that, if you're going to make a living out of it, or at least a success in publishing or broadcasting terms, you've got to do.
Absolutely fascinating. Thank you, Michael, for taking us on such a broad tour of your writing and introducing the concept of script writing for both radio and theatre, and also your methods of writing short stories.
Thank you, Lorna.
To anybody who would like to get a copy of My Village in the Valley or Personal Islands, both collections of short stories are available now. They're out in paperback and ebook from all the usual booksellers. And if you'd like to join us next time on the podcast, we'll be talking to a children's author about the adventures of a cathedral cat. So thank you from me at Crumps Barn Studio, and I hope you'll join us next time.